the degree of dynamism in international capitalism in the last generation has created a greater sense of loss in parts of the population in the United States.
Do you get aroused by stimulating intellectual conversation? Are you turned on by the idea of engaging with thought leaders from across the United States? Do you go gaga over exploring important ideas from influential books, research, and essays? Then welcome to Curiosity Porn, the place you can satisfy all those intellectual urges guilt-free. Your hosts are Dr. Guy Crane, Professor of Philosophy at Rose State College, and Professor James Davenport, Professor of Political Science at Rose State College. However, the views expressed here are solely the views of the hosts and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. And now, here are James and Guy.
James.
Dr. Crane, how are you doing?
I'm okay. We're doing another one of those not in the same place at the same time episodes.
I was going to say the luxurious podcast studio here at Possibilities, Inc. is a little lonely right now, as I'm the only one in it. But you, of course, because you are so dedicated to our listeners, have found a way to make this podcast work, even though you are nowhere near where I'm at.
I am coming to the listeners from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We are up here visiting family. My sister-in-law and our nieces. We're having a great time with our nieces. But yes, I definitely still wanted to do a podcast. And so I use some sort of sorcery or magic, or maybe it's just technology. Probably it's technology. That's what I'm doing today. And that's okay. We've done this before and it has worked out great every time.
Because we have a superstar producer by the name of Santiago who makes all of this turn into something worth listening to at the end of the day.
Our people seriously work magic, and none so much as Santiago. Absolutely. Very thankful for him. And primo guest today. Primo. Yes?
Yes. I was super excited when we found out we were going to get to visit with Dr. Jerry Muller, who is a historian and professor emeritus at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., where he has been since 1984. His work spans across the history of social, political, economic, and religious thought. And today we are very excited to talk about two of his books, The Mind and the Market and The Tyranny of Metrics. And Dr. Muller, I just want we have both read both of these books. And I think one of us is kind of like, oh, this is the one. And the other one is, no, this is the one. So we couldn't decide. And we said, we're going to ask about both of them. So we're excited to do that. We're excited to have you with us today.
Okay, specialization and the division of labor is an important theme in thinking about capitalism.
Hey, perfect. Exactly. We've got a couple of kind of get to know you questions that we're going to run you through first, and then we will hit the meat of our discussion today. So let's start with this one. What's one interesting thing you are currently reading, listening to, or watching?
Well, I'm reading a number of books at the moment that are related to a book that I'm working on called Passing It On, Thinking Across Generations About Money, Time, and Purpose. So I've been reading books about various stages of the life cycle. And among the two I've read or reread most recently are one by Brian Kaplan called Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, which was a very sensible book, and an older book by the legal scholar Richard Posner, who was very influenced by economic theory, a book called Aging and Old Age, which is about how one changes as one gets older and what are the advantages and disadvantages that come with aging and how that affects people's professional and financial lives.
Wow, that sounds great.
Interesting. I'm reading a book that you might have read or know of called The Happiness Curve by Jonathan Rauch, but it is kind of along those same lines. So I am glad to hear you're writing another book, and I look forward to seeing this one because this is a topic that as I get a little older, I get a little bit more interested in. So.
Yes, I haven't read Jonathan Rauch's book. I haven't read that book, though I've listened to him do interviews about it and have a pretty good sense of its thesis, and it sounds very sensible.
Well, all right. Who is the greatest historian of all time?
I don't really know because I'm not that familiar with historians before the 20th century, to tell you the truth. But I can tell you who's the historian that I have regarded most highly. I think for many years I taught an introductory graduate course to the study of history where we studied essentially great works of history. And the one that I taught most consistently over 2 or 3 decades is a book by the great French historian Marc Bloch called Feudal Society, which he published in 1939 to 1940. And it combines elements of geography, anthropology, politics, religion, and of course, military history to give one a sort of extremely rounded picture of what was characteristic of medieval European society. And it's precisely that sort of multiplicity of perspectives that I most admire in great historians.
Very interesting. Very interesting. All right. What is the one thing about your work you wish people understood better?
I think the only one thing I wish they understood better is that unlike some people who write about one topic or one related set of topics for their whole career, I've written about a variety of topics and continue to be interested in them. So I've written a couple of books having to do with intellectuals and politics. My first book and my most recent book have largely to do with that. I've written a couple of books having to do with books and given lecture series on how intellectuals have thought about capitalism. That's another topic. I've also written about conservatism. And some people know me from one or another of these topics, but don't know the fact that I've written about other varied topics as well. Not to speak of the tyranny of metrics, which is a sort of cousin of the work on capitalism and conservatism.
Well, all right. Let's get into it. And I think we're going to start with the Mind in the Market book. And then midway, we'll turn into tyranny of metrics. So in that book, Mind in the Market, you write that the book is based on the assumption that capitalism is too important and complex a subject to be left to economists. That's how you put it. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. Economists tend to define their field by its various techniques and technical possibilities. And not all of those, but most of those focus on data, on measurable data and measurable standardized data. And as a result, there are many elements about the history of capitalism and about contemporary capitalism that their work simply fails to recapture. For example, the cultural prerequisites of successful capitalism. What sort of culture do people have to have? What sort of assumptions do they have? What sorts of modes of behavior are most conducive to the development of a capitalist society? And conversely, what are the cultural effects of capitalism? That's something that also economists, because it's unmeasurable or difficult to measure and rather intangible, tend not to focus on. Similarly, the political prerequisites and the political uses of capitalism. So the extent to which, for example, the promotion of capitalist development by governments has often been in order to raise the tax base so that they can engage in self-defense. So the relationship between military goals and capitalism. Those sorts of topics, although there are some economists who are interested in them and have become more interested in them in the last generation or so, on the whole, they're not conducive to the kinds of tools that economists typically deploy. And that's what I meant.
I think of that in similar terms. As a political scientist, we talk about oftentimes the prerequisites for democracy emerging, and many of the same kinds of things you're discussing. What are the cultural attributes? What are the expectations and values and opportunities that are within? What are the institutions of civil society that exist to support that kind of democratic structure? And I think, thinking about capitalism in that same way holds a lot of value for people in understanding it.
Yes, these things are dynamic, and similarly, instituting a democratic system not only has certainly cultural prerequisites, but it also has cultural effects that one needs to take into account. So yes, the dynamics are similar.
Now, I'm a really big fan on defining terms, and as you mentioned, economists like to define certain things as well. But I like to make sure that everybody's on the same page when we're talking about things. So often I find that people are discussing something and they'll use the same language, but they're not meaning the same thing. So I want to give you the opportunity to define capitalism for our audience. And what, in your opinion, has made it seem so durable over time?
Let me deal with the two separate questions. First of all, of definition. So I define it in the following ways. A society or a situation in which one has a government that is strong enough to protect private property and enforce contracts. Secondly, a system of exchange that's based primarily on supply and demand by privately owned organizations. Thirdly, commodification. That is, a society in which most people buy most of the things that they consume and need to earn money in order to do so. And fourth, typically a society, an economy and society based on free labor. That is, where people are work for cash. This is the cash nexus, and are free to change their employment. Now, that's not always the case. There are important cases in the history of capitalism where it's gone together with some degree of serfdom or some degree of slavery. But on the whole, capitalist societies tend to be those based upon free labor. So I would make those the main defining elements. As to the question of why capitalism is so durable, well, first of all, I should note it's not always durable. There are times when it's fallen apart and been replaced by other systems. But on the whole, it's been quite durable, I would say, for a couple of reasons. First of all, its utilization of a basic element of human nature, namely self-interest. And rather than trying to eliminate or extirpate self-interest, capitalism, when it's successful, channels self-interest through a series of institutions, including a competitive market, in a way that tends to lead, at least in the long run, to an improvement in material well-being. Secondly, its ability to utilize or to be combined with a variety of political configurations. So really, there are many varieties of capitalism and many shades of capitalism. And it's combined with a variety of governmental forms, from authoritarian to Republican and democratic. And when it is combined with democracy, it typically results in the medium run and in the long run in some degree of social democracy. That is to say, capitalism, a market combined with various governmental mechanisms that help compensate for some of the disadvantages created by the market. So I would say those are the main factors.
And, historically, capitalism has not been without its opponents. I'm sure many of our listeners have heard the name Karl Marx before, one of the infamous historical opponents of capitalism, but certainly not the only one. You talk about these folks. What seems to unite the opponents of capitalism, and maybe what are the major differences? Also, do you think these opponents like Marx, are there things they get particularly right about capitalism? And maybe what do you think they get particularly wrong about capitalism?
Okay. So there's a lot there. So opponents of capitalism from various parts of the left and various parts of the right are united by the fact that they have complaints about capitalism, but they tend to complain about rather different things. So let's start with the left tends to complain in one way or another about the degree of inequality in capitalist societies. That was one of Marx's concerns, though it wasn't Marx's only concern, and it wasn't in some ways the most interesting or lasting of his complaints about capitalism. I think if you look at Marx's key analytic concepts and his key predictions about capitalism, they're not of very high. They're of little value. Analytic concepts like the labor theory of value doesn't do really anything to explain the actual workings of prices and wages in a capitalist society for reasons that were examined by the so-called marginalist school. His notion that of the falling rate of profit as inevitable under capitalism wasn't right. His prediction of the immiseration of the proletariat over the long run wasn't right either. But he did have some key moral insights, though they're by no means his alone. One is that in the absence of countervailing forces, one can easily have the exploitation of workers in a capitalist society. Of course, one has it also in socialist societies, but one can have it in a capitalist society. That is, attempts by bosses or managers to get ever more labor out of their workers and have them work longer and harder and so on. There's something to that. Marx was also acute about the possible alienating effects of the division of labor. Now, most of what he had to say about that was already said by Adam Smith in Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations, but still, it's a point that Marx emphasized. So that's on Marx and the then on the leftist side, in sort of later variations, well after Marx, one has interesting critiques, some of which I think are valid, like by Herbert Marcuse, who insisted that capitalism creates new wants. That's true. He wasn't the first to say that. But he made the point that sometimes capitalism can inculcate wants in people that lead them to have to work longer or harder or under more alienating conditions than if they didn't have those wants. Now, Marcuse is not the only one to make that point. Pope John Paul II made it as well in some of his encyclicals, but it's a useful thing to keep in mind. That's on the left side. If you want, we can turn to the right side and the kinds of critiques that conservative thinkers have put forward. Should we do that?
Yeah. When I first read The Mind of the Market, one of the things that really stood out to me was the amount of criticism of capitalism that had come from what we might describe as kind of conservative thinkers. As someone who had come up in what what I thought of as a conservative tradition, I was almost surprised to see some of these criticisms. And so could you walk us through some of those kind of conservative criticisms of capitalism, or some of the major themes there?
Sure. So they take a variety of forms, but here's some of them. Going back to thinkers like the German thinker Justus Muller in the late 18th century, put forward a series of critiques of what we would now call globalization, though that wasn't the term that he used. And you'll see that some of them remain highly resonant. So Muller, for example, noted that factors like the division of labor, innovation, and competition from abroad leads to an influx of less expensive goods that can often undermine the economic basis of existing ways of life. So in his case, in late 18th century Germany, he was particularly interested in the way in which it destroyed the economic basis of the guilds, in which many people were involved in something that was a key aspect of their identity. So that notion that in one way or another capitalism undermines or destroys the economic basis of existing ways of life, it's an ongoing conservative critique. Secondly, and this one finds on the left and on the right, but one finds it in Muller and others too, that capitalism creates new wants that are untraditional and that some conservatives see as unnecessary. A third kind of critique is that it destroys national cultures or national particularity by leading to an influx of goods, including not just pots and pans, but all kinds of cultural goods and cultural influences from other cultures. And that tends to undermine, as I say, either national cultures or local cultures. Another critique is of international finance or international capital as being unpatriotic, as being interested in maximizing profit wherever it is to be found, without a commitment to a particular place or a particular nation. That's something that one finds in late 18th century critics of capitalism, especially of new forms of capitalist finance at the time, and one continues to hear that. So, as you can probably already notice, those criticisms have reemerged recently in the United States. American conservatism has many different forms. And for a long time, it was a combination of a kind of cultural and social conservatism combined with a kind of embrace or acceptance of the dynamic elements of capitalism. And one still finds that in some contemporary conservative thinkers like, say, George F. Will. But one sees now in the United States in the last decade or two, a recrudescence, you might say, of some of these older critiques of capitalism as embodied, for example, in the Republican vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance. And the notion there is that some of the very forces of capitalist dynamism and innovation that have actually meant material progress for many people around the world have also produced losers. Blue-collar workers in the United States whose way of life has been disrupted or destroyed, partly actually by automation, which is part of capitalist innovation, but people like Vance tend to focus on the role of international trade and the influx of goods made from abroad. So they try then to come up with policies that would protect or insulate these traditional ways of life of American blue-collar workers. And so that's something that's relatively new, actually, in American conservatism. But these older themes of European conservatism are now becoming dominant, or at least more salient on the American right.
Do you have a sense of why that seems to be, those criticisms seem to be emerging at this point in time? What's kind of driving this pushback from conservative thinkers or politicians on capitalism?
I think a good deal of it is due to the dynamism of international capitalism in the period since the late 1970s, in other words, in the last generation, from the late 1970s to the present. In the 30 years before that, in the 30 years after or at least in the 25 years after the Second World War, the United States had such a dominant position in the international economy, especially in the creation of manufactured goods, in part because, the manufactured basis of some of our competitors, like Germany and Japan, had been heavily damaged in the Second World War. So American automakers and steel makers and so on emerged with a kind of monopoly in international trade, and that allowed for the creation of kind of internal welfare states in the auto industry, in the steel industry, and so on. And then with the rise of more global competition and international trade, and especially the influx of millions and millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of new workers into the international capitalist economy, with the rise of China and to some degree India and other places, it eroded it destroyed that monopoly, and it destroyed the ability of some of those American industries to provide their blue-collar workers with the same standard of living that they'd become accustomed to. So the brief answer, I think, is that the degree of dynamism in international capitalism in the last generation has created a greater sense of loss in parts of the population in the United States. I think that's how I would explain it.
Well, we spent a good time talking about the critics of capitalism, but there's a pretty long list of defenders as well, which are every bit the intellectual peers of the critics. Which of these advocates for capitalism, in your mind, stand out for their analysis, and what do they bring to this discussion that is unique?
Yeah. So, yes, I would say that I would say that the greatest advocates of capitalism and analysts of capitalism are great in part because of their awareness of the fact that it has downsides, which they sought to point to and to alleviate. But they also, of course, focused on its positive elements. So I think the greatest of them is still Adam Smith. I wrote a book about him, Adam Smith and His Time and Ours, Designing the Decent Society. And, Smith lays out the arguments for why, under the right institutional conditions, capitalism can lead to a higher standard of living for the great mass of the population, how it can lead to what he called universal opulence. And he pointed out to the role of self-interest and how if it was channeled through the competitive market, that would make possible a greater division of labor, a greater degree of specialization, a greater degree of innovation, a greater degree of productivity. And if you combine that with a competitive market, it would lead in the long run to the prices of goods going down, and that would benefit the great mass of people in terms of their standard of living. That remains actually the most important argument in favor of capitalism, I think, and one finds it brilliantly articulated in Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations. Then I would add a couple of others, of other thinkers who I think were particularly brilliant in their analyses of one or another element of capitalism. One is the German sociologist and philosopher Georg Simmel, who wrote a number of relevant works, but the most famous one is a book of 1900 called The Philosophy of Money. And there, among other things, he was very interested in the cultural effects of capitalism. For example, the fact that living in an economy based upon money and based upon constantly having to make calculations of how much you want to spend to buy something and what are the opportunity costs of not doing so, how that leads to a greater degree of abstraction in the way in which people think. I think that's an overlooked insight. He also pointed, for example, to the positive roles of competition. He pointed out competition isn't just a competition between two competitors. There's a third element involved, namely the person or the group that each competitor wants to appeal to. And so if you have two entrepreneurs or two companies who are trying to appeal to a consumer, he pointed out that not only do they have to try to get into the mindset of the consumer to understand the consumer's wants, but sometimes they can imagine wants that the consumer might have that the consumer himself doesn't know he could possibly have. So, for example, we're talking on a computer that I have on my desk. If you had told me when I got out of graduate school in 1984 that everybody would have a computer on their desk or a computer in their pocket in the form of a cell phone, I would have said, "Are you crazy? A computer is the size of a room. You need it to launch rockets to the moon, but why would I need one?" But there were people who imagined that maybe one would want to have a computer on one's desk, and then somebody imagined you might want to have one in your pocket. And then you could talk to people across the country for free. So those are the sorts of, there's a sense in which competition leads the competitors to imagine possibilities for the consumer that the consumer himself doesn't have. And then the third one I would point to as of the third thinker I would point to as of really perennial interest is Joseph Schumpeter, who wrote from about 1910 through about 1945. And his emphasis was on the dynamism of capitalism, the fact that it's not just a matter of supply and demand, but capitalism changes constantly through processes of innovation, where you have entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial companies creating new means of making things, new means of marketing things, new means of distributing things. And that creative, dynamic element of capitalism he called creative destruction, because those new ways of making and distributing things also destroy older ways of making and distributing and marketing things, and destroy the ways of life that go together with that. This goes back to that theme from Justus Muller from the late 18th century. But by emphasizing the fact that the dynamic element of capitalism, the fact that it constantly creates new winners and new losers, he pointed out something that's very important in terms of understanding it. We could go on, but I think those would be the big three that I would choose.
All right. Well, you do point out that maybe unchecked markets aren't a good thing. You do write that there's a need for counter market institutions is the term. Can you explain what you mean by that term? Maybe give some examples, and why would those kinds of institutions, why are they important?
the market is motivated largely by self-interest. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean selfishness, but it means individuals engage in market activity, be it working in a company or buying a particular commodity, because of their own perceived self-interest, right? And that works well in the market when it's properly channeled in the way that Adam Smith described, with competition and so on. But to live your whole life on the basis of self-interest makes for rather unhappy and unpleasant people. And so it's important to have institutions in life, contexts in life, that cultivate elements of us other than our self-interest, at least our self-interest as narrowly understood. So among those countervailing institutions would be, for example, the family, right? If you run your marriage on the basis of self-interest and you're calculating each day, what did I do for my wife? What did my wife do for me today? You're not going to be happily married, and perhaps you're not going to be married for very long either. If you think about having children in terms of how much pleasure are they going to give me today, and how much are they going to cost me today, or how much are they going to cost me in the next 10 years, and you're constantly making those kind of calculations, you're not going to be a very good parent. So there are realms like the family where we develop elements of ourselves, altruistic elements of ourselves that are conducive to a more happy and flourishing life and society. Similarly, there are institutions like schools or colleges that should be developing elements of us other than self-interest, at least self-interest as narrowly understood. And so too, for example, with churches or with the military. In the military, if you're constantly calculating what's in it for me, narrowly understood, you're not going to risk your life. And a soldier who's not willing to risk his life isn't going to be a very good soldier, and a country that can't produce soldiers who are willing to risk their lives probably isn't going to last as an independent country for very long. So again, those are kinds of character traits like courage, self-sacrifice, and so on. You could call them character traits, you can call them virtues, that a thriving society needs to develop, but that are not inculcated by and large by the market itself. That's what I meant by countervailing institutions. And that's something that the most important analysts of capitalism have tended to emphasize as well.
Well, I got one last question over the mind of the market, then we're going to switch to the tyranny of metrics. But I'm always curious about this. In the United States, at least since the Great Depression, there seem to have been kind of two intellectual figures that have shaped the debate over economic policy in the U.S., John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek. And they kind of loom large, if not explicitly mentioned. Their ideas seem to continuously come back and they rebound off each other. What was the fundamental difference between these two thinkers about capitalism? And is there something that each of them got right and got wrong about the way they approach thinking about capitalism?
Yeah. So it should be said that both of those thinkers, John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek, were essentially pro-capitalist. I mean, they both thought that, capitalist economy had a lot of advantages, that it was better than any foreseeable alternative, that it was conducive to individual liberty, something with which both of them highly valued. And so on that level, there's actually a great deal of overlap and convergence. I would say the main difference between them in a way that has lasting effects is on the level of method. Keynes thought that you could have measurable aggregates of labor, aggregates of production, aggregates of the money supply that could be calculated and could be manipulated by government to try to minimize some of the disruptive effects of capitalism, such as eras of high unemployment. He thought that you could use government spending and monetary policy and levels of taxation to try to manipulate those variables to try to keep capitalism on what you might call a more even keel. Now, of course, he's writing in the shadow of the Great Depression at a time when major countries were turning either fascist or communist. One can understand his concerns, but on the level of method and policy, then the emphasis is on what is measurable and what is manipulable. Hayek, by contrast, was skeptical of the degree to which many of the most important elements in a capitalist society could be measured. He was skeptical of the degree to which economics as a discipline could try to imitate the physical sciences in their precision of measurement. And he was skeptical of the ability of policymakers to manipulate government spending and monetary policy in such a way as to stabilize the capitalist economy. He pointed out that a number of those, he often pointed out that such measures were, such measurements were unreliable, and that government measures like manipulating the money supply could have medium and negative long-term effects, like creating inflation. So I would say those are the main distinctions between the two.
Hello, folks. My name is Guy Crane. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. We decided to make this episode a two-parter since our guest was very generous with his time and discussed both of these books at length with us. So tune in next time for part two of our discussion with Dr. Jerry Muller, where we will be discussing his book, The Tyranny of Metrics, and when we will be asking him our special question. Thanks for listening to Curiosity Porn with the two best intellectual pole dancers in the United States, Dr. Guy Crane and Professor James Davenport. If you'd like to share a comment about today's episode, suggest a guest or topic, or just leave a compliment or complaint, you can reach us at curprn@gmail.com. We hope to hear from you.